I want to thank the gentleman. Excellent. Apparently, it's obvious that you guys have studied the Cuba issue a lot more than elements within the administration. You bring a very concise message to this committee, and it's much appreciated. I have a message for Raul Castro in Cuba. You can get off the state sponsor of terrorism list if you quit sponsoring terrorism. You quit providing illicit arms to North Korea outside of the embargo. You could probably have normalized relations with the United States if you allowed more economic freedom, personal freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech for the people of Cuba. Make some reforms. We got nothing out of this deal that benefited the Cuban people. I asked Secretary Kerry yesterday, is the State Department and the President going to remove Cuba from the list? He said, we're reviewing it. Staff talked to their staff. It looks like it may be June is a target date for that. We're not going to give Guantanamo Bay back, not as long as I have a vote in the United States Congress, and I think my colleagues do as well. I'm fearful that we just won't make the lease payment because it's a leased property at a very affordable lease rate, if you know what the lease is. Whoever negotiated that deal needs to go negotiate more on behalf of the United States of America. It's a strategic base for the United States, but we don't want to give that back to Cuba. They can turn around and give it to the Russians to have a warm water port in our hemisphere. That'd be wrong. I want to see more freedom and economic opportunity, economic freedom, more freedom of speech, more involvement in self-governance for the Cuban people. Those are things, those are ideals and the principles that Americans adhere to. That's what we'd love to see for the Cuban people. We see nothing out of the Obama administration for the Cuban people. The economic benefit they may get is maybe some artwork purchased on the street by American tourists, but every other economic transaction benefits the Castro regime. It's a national security issue, as we're the emphasis of this hearing today. We've got the Lord's Base, which is an intelligence gathering base in Cuba, 150 miles off our shore. To your knowledge, Mr. Simmons, has the U.S. ever conducted a comprehensive damage assessment of the Cuban espionage against the United States?
To the best of my knowledge, every damage assessment is done on a case-by-case basis. For example, with Anna Montes or Kendall Myers, I'm not aware of any comprehensive look back over the last 55 years.
Do you agree with my assessment earlier that Americans could be targets of espionage should they travel to Cuba and stay in military-owned, intelligence-operated hotels?
I disagree with the word could.
Thank you. I take that as they will.
Absolutely. As I indicated in my statement, for several years now, essentially 20 years almost since the end of the Soviet aid, the Castro brothers have allowed the intelligence and military services to run the tourism sector as a profit-making enterprise, one in which they are now allowed to recycle part of the earnings into their own intelligence budgets. So every tourist that stays at the Hotel Nacional or any other entity in Cuba not only pays for the spying against them, but allows repression to increase to levels that were not previously achievable.
Thank you. So do you believe that more Americans could possibly be recruited to spy for Cuba as a result of this policy shift? And we had the DIA agent that I mentioned in my opening statement. You think more Americans could be recruited?
I think opening diplomatic relations with Cuba means open season for espionage operations. It, in all senses, incentivizes what has already been a cash cow for the Castro regime, drives down their cost of espionage, and gives them an access throughout the United States, which they haven't had since 1961.
You know, there's a lot of outrage within the American people and with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to Edward Snowden's release of security intelligence to Russia. Who would the Cubans possibly give intelligence that they gathered from Americans to?
We know historically they've provided information to Russia, China, North Korea, Haiti, any nation that has something to offer in trade, whether it's cash or quarterly weapons shipments from China. I think a more recent example, if I may, I recently became aware that Cuba ran a long-term penetration of the National Reconnaissance Office until 2012. I've confirmed this with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Director of National Intelligence has failed to answer my queries, but I found out from the Air Force that this long-term penetration was briefed by a Master Sergeant Tessa Fontaine to the Director of National Intelligence, and the case apparently ended shortly before our secret negotiations began. Given Cuba's total absence of a satellite reconnaissance program, my question to the committee would be, who were they selling that information to?
Right. Yeah, thank you. I agree. I want to point to something in the remaining time I've got that Dr. Hazel had in his opening statement, that General Castro is making demands on the United States for normalized relations. And you say that, and this is from General Castro, unconditionally eliminate all economic sanctions, return Cuba, the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, stop all transmissions of Radio Free America or Radio TV Marti, compensate Cuba for the supposed damage caused by the embargo, which Cuba estimates at $116 billion, and that number is growing. Who knows what the number will be? And eliminate Cuba from the U.S. state sponsors of terrorism list. Those are his demands on the United States. What demands have the United States made on Cuba? Can you answer that question? What demands have the United States made?
None that I am aware of, and that is why this is unconditional, unilateral. It's what I really fear we are doing. It's not asking anything in return. And unfortunately, I suspect that we may begin to hear some arguments that, again, maybe the U.S. naval base is not that important, or, maybe Cuba is entitled to some compensation and the like. And that is really my fear going forward.
Oh, spot on. My time's up. I'm going to yield to the ranking member, and I look forward to the second round of questioning.